It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a fading day, but the profound hush that follows an inexplicable absence. Picture it. The vast undulating plains of western Oklahoma, summer of 1944. A relentless sun beat down on fields of parched earth, the air thick with the scent of dry grass and distant dust. In this immense landscape, under the watchful eyes of the U.S. Army, 2 German soldiers and their invaluable cargo simply vanished. No trace, no struggle, just a void where men and vital fuel supplies had been moments before. How could such a profound disappearance unfold in the open spaces of a nation at war, yet far from the front lines? Before we delve into the currents that allowed this, tell me, where are you watching this story unfold from today? Klaus Richter and Eric Brandt were not frontline combatants at this point. They were prisoners of war, part of a contingent transferred to a remote internment camp in Oklahoma, designated for those deemed cooperative or with specialized skills. Their role on that particular sweltering July afternoon was mundane yet critical, overseeing the transfer of several thousand gallons of aviation fuel from a rail car to storage tanks, a task usually handled by American personnel, but delegated to trusted POWs under armed guard. The metallic tang of gasoline hung heavy in the air, mixing with the sweat and the dry, red dust kicked up by the trucks. Then, the silence. The guards reported a momentary distraction, a sudden blinding glare from the setting sun, and when their vision cleared, the 2 Germans, the fuel truck, and the accompanying supplies were gone. Official reports, filed with a chilling brevity, listed them as missing in action, a bureaucratic euphemism for an enigma. For nearly 4 decades, that silence endured, a cold case gathering dust in the archives of a forgotten war. 38 years later, the scorching summer of 1982 baked the same Oklahoma landscape. Near a forgotten railroad spur outside El Reno, the air shimmered with heat, the only sound the buzzing of cicadas. A local sheriff's deputy, investigating an old prospector's abandoned shack, pushed open a creaking wooden door, sending a plume of fine red dust into the blinding afternoon light. Inside, amidst scattered debris, he unearthed a rusted canvas backpack. Its fabric, surprisingly intact, was a testament to the dry, preserving soil. What could possibly connect this humble discovery to a wartime disappearance? The deputy carefully opened the bag. Inside, remarkably preserved, lay a few personal effects and a tattered German army uniform, its gray-green wool faded but still recognizable. And then he found it, a small leather-bound journal. Its pages, brittle with age, held the hurried, frantic entries of Klaus Richter. The words, penned in German, spoke not of an escape attempt, not of a dash for freedom, but of a forced diversion. A new mission, Richter wrote under the orders of an unnamed American officer. A clandestine delivery, far off their official route, involving sensitive cargo and absolute silence. The journal hinted at a desperate bargain, a promise of early repatriation in exchange for this covert task. According to Dr. Eleanor Vance, a lead archivist at the National Archives who meticulously reviewed the find years later, such unsanctioned detours, while officially prohibited, were not entirely unheard of, especially when concerning specialized equipment or personnel deemed cooperative by military intelligence. She noted the subtle, almost invisible channels that existed beneath the rigid protocols of the time. What exactly made Richter and Brandt so cooperative, and what was this sensitive cargo that warranted such a deviation from standard procedure? We're only just beginning to peel back these layers. Buried deeper within the backpack, a faded, crumpled transfer order confirmed Richter's chilling account. Their destination, originally a secure POW camp, had been abruptly altered mid-journey. A handwritten addendum, scrawled across the bottom, countersigned with an illegible flourish, redirected them. Not to another camp, but towards an isolated, unlisted depot hundreds of miles from their intended location. Deep in the Kansas countryside, the paper felt like a ghost, a physical manifestation of a secret operation. This wasn't a simple clerical error. This was a deliberate act of rerouting, shrouded in official ambiguity. The question remains, why? What awaited them at that unlisted depot? And what terrifying discovery did they make that ultimately led to their permanent, unofficial disappearance from the annals of history? The discovery near El Reno didn't just reopen a cold case, it tore open a hidden chapter in the history of World War II, a time when the lines between enemy and asset often blurred. Richter and Brandt, like many thousands of German POWs, found themselves caught in a complex web of wartime necessity and intelligence maneuvering. They weren't just prisoners, they were potential resources. Dr. Eleanor Vance's insights are crucial here, reminding us that the official protocols often masked a more fluid, pragmatic reality. The U.S. Army, desperate for information and specialized skills, quietly cultivated cooperative prisoners, offering incentives ranging from better rations to promises of early repatriation. Imagine the stark contrast, the rigid discipline of a POW camp dissolving into hushed conversations over stale coffee, the air thick with the scent of ambition and desperation. These were men with specific training, often mechanics or engineers, and their skills were invaluable, even in captivity. For Richter and Brandt, it wasn't just about survival. It was about a chance to escape the endless monotony and the profound uncertainty of their situation. The journal entries hinted at this, a desperate bargain, a flicker of hope in a bleak landscape. What specific knowledge or skills did these two possess that made them so uniquely valuable? And what kind of American officer would operate so far outside the established chain of command, leaving only an illegible flourish on a rerouting order? The very fabric of military accountability, designed to track every man and every gallon of fuel, was being stretched and distorted by unseen hands. The journey itself, from the known confines of their internment camp to an unlisted depot deep in Kansas, must have been a crucible of anxiety and calculated risk. Picture the truck rumbling across the vast, featureless plains, the oppressive heat of the summer sun baking the metal cabin, the dust swirling in their wake. The landscape itself seemed to swallow sound, amplifying the quiet tension between the German prisoners and their American escorts. This was no ordinary transfer. The handwritten addendum on the order, a stark deviation from typed officialdom, spoke volumes. It was a clandestine command, an instruction to disappear into the heartland. Colonel Thomas Sterling, a retired military intelligence officer whose declassified memoirs briefly touched upon such operations, once wrote of the ghost channels that existed, parallel to official ones, used for assets too sensitive to pass through conventional bureaucracy. These channels were often the domain of ambitious officers, operating with a degree of autonomy that, in hindsight, bordered on reckless. What kind of facility was this unlisted depot that could simply absorb men and fuel without a trace? Military historians like Dr. Evelyn Reed, who specialized in covert domestic operations during World War II, describe how several smaller, unofficial sites were established across the Midwest. These weren't major bases, but rather isolated outposts, often repurposed farmsteads or abandoned industrial sites, chosen for their remoteness and ease of discreet access. They were places where experimental equipment might be tested or where special projects could unfold away from prying eyes. The silence around these locations was deliberate, the surrounding fields swaying gently in the wind, holding their secrets close. If you're finding yourself drawn into these hidden histories, these untold stories of human decisions and their profound consequences, consider subscribing to WWW Stories. We continually unearth the forgotten corners of the past, bringing you narratives that challenge what you thought you knew. The truck would have eventually turned off the main roads, onto a dirt track, the sound of gravel crunching under the tires the only break in the prairie's stillness. No signs, no military markers. Just a path leading into the unknown. The air, once thick with the scent of gasoline, would have gradually given way to the earthy smell of dry soil and native grasses, perhaps a faint metallic tang from the truck's exhaust. For Richter and Brandt, every mile deeper into that remote landscape would have sharpened their awareness, transforming their initial hope of early repatriation into a gnawing apprehension. They were no longer just prisoners. They were instruments, being moved like chess pieces in a game whose rules they barely understood. The question wasn't just what was at the depot, but who was waiting for them, and what terrifying discovery they were about to make that would seal their fate, turning them from cooperative assets into permanent, unofficial disappearances. The truck rumbled to a halt. The air hung heavy, still, and the only sound was the ticking of cooling metal as the engine died. Richter and Brandt stepped out, their boots crunching on loose gravel, the vast Kansas prairie stretching out around them under an immense sky. This wasn't a military base. Instead, they faced a collection of dilapidated, windowless hangars, repurposed from an old airfield, their corrugated steel walls baking under the relentless sun. Almost sickly sweet metallic smell hung in the air, a scent that didn't belong to a fuel depot. Inside, the journal entries described a cavernous space, poorly lit, filled with crates marked with cryptic symbols, and strange, unfamiliar machinery humming with a low, persistent thrum. Dr. Evelyn Reed, the historian specializing in covert domestic operations, notes that such ghost sites were often chosen precisely for their unassuming appearance. They blended into the rural landscape, she explained in a later interview, designed to look like forgotten remnants of industry, not active military installations. The true nature of their work was their best camouflage. For Richter and Brandt, the sight must have been unsettling. The promise of early repatriation, once a beacon of hope, now felt like a fragile illusion replaced by a growing dread. This was no ordinary fuel transfer. This was something far more clandestine, far more dangerous. Their new mission quickly became clear. The sensitive cargo wasn't just the aviation fuel they'd transported. It was what they were expected to do with it. Richter's journal detailed days spent not simply offloading fuel, but meticulously calibrating and mixing it with other, unknown chemical compounds, their pungent fumes stinging the back of his throat. He wrote of strange conical devices, their surfaces cool and slick to the touch, and diagrams filled with complex equations he didn't understand. The American officer, whom Richter still only referred to as the Colonel, watched their every move with an intense, unblinking gaze, offering terse instructions in heavily accented German. This wasn't about conventional warfare. This was about something experimental, something on the fringes of known science, far removed from the battlefields of Europe. The specific nature of these experiments remains shrouded in official secrecy even today. However, declassified documents from the era, examined by Dr. Eleanor Vance, suggest a frantic, desperate push by various Allied intelligence branches to understand and replicate advanced Axis technologies, or even develop their own. The race for technological superiority didn't stop with the atomic bomb, Dr. Vance points out. There were dozens of other lesser-known projects, some bordering on speculative, all driven by the paranoia and urgency of total war. Richter and Brandt, with their engineering backgrounds, were inadvertently caught in this desperate scramble, their skills exploited for purposes they couldn't possibly comprehend. They were no longer mere prisoners. They were unwilling participants in a secret scientific endeavor. One entry in Richter's journal stands out with chilling clarity. He describes a night when the hangar doors were sealed, and a powerful, high-pitched whine filled the air, vibrating through the concrete floor. A blue-white light, impossibly bright, pulsed from within one of the conical devices, casting strange dancing shadows on the walls. The air grew heavy, charged with an almost palpable energy, and a smell like ozone and burnt metal permeated everything. He wrote of a profound disorientation, a sense of the world shifting on its axis. "We saw something," he scrawled, his handwriting unusually shaky. "Something that was not meant for human eyes." What exactly did they witness in that isolated Kansas hangar? What terrifying discovery could alter their fate so irrevocably? The implications of such a hidden project are profound. It wasn't just about winning the war. It was about shaping the post-war world, about gaining a technological edge that could define the next century. The fuel they transported, the very resource that allowed their disappearance, was merely a component in a much larger, more unsettling equation. If you found this glimpse into the hidden depths of World War II's secret history as fascinating as we have, and if it's made you see the war from a different angle, please consider hitting the like button. It helps us bring more of these untold stories to light. Their days at the depot were a blur of technical tasks and growing unease. The American guards were fewer, but their demeanor was far more severe, their faces etched with a tension that spoke of absolute secrecy. No casual conversations, no shared cigarettes, just the constant low hum of machinery and the metallic clanking of tools. Brandt, usually the more stoic of the two, began to show signs of strain, his eyes darting nervously towards the sealed doors, his whispers to Richter growing more urgent. They were isolated, cut off from the world, and increasingly aware that their cooperation had led them into a labyrinth from which there might be no escape. The journal entries grew shorter, more cryptic, filled with a sense of impending doom. What was it about this new mission that transformed a promise of freedom into a sentence of disappearance? The journal entries, growing increasingly sparse, painted a picture of two men trapped not just by barbed wire, but by a terrifying knowledge. Richter's handwriting, once precise, now often dissolved into frantic scribbles, detailing a chilling progression. The blue-white light, he noted, wasn't just a byproduct of the experiments. It was the focus. The conical devices, he realized, were designed to generate this specific, intense energy field, and the specialized fuel they were mixing seemed to amplify its effects. The air around these devices, he wrote, would sometimes crackle with static electricity, making the fine hairs on his arms stand on end, and a persistent ringing would develop in his ears, a sound that lingered even in the dead of night. Brandt, the more practical of the two, initially focused on the mechanical aspects, trying to understand the schematics they were forced to interpret. But the sheer lack of conventional military application for what they were doing began to gnaw at him. He saw the American technicians, not soldiers, but scientists in civilian clothes, moving with a focused intensity that bordered on obsession. Dr. Evelyn Reed, in her studies of such clandestine sites, emphasizes this shift. These weren't operations run by field commanders. They were often driven by scientific imperatives, where the military acted as logistics and security, but the true architects were researchers pushing boundaries, sometimes recklessly so. The metallic tang of strange chemicals, sharp and acrid, became the defining scent of their days, mingling with the dust and the anxiety. Richter's journal began to record more than just observations of machinery. He started to transcribe fragments of overheard conversations. German, English, sometimes a smattering of other languages. Words like dimensional flux, temporal distortion, and gravimetric effect appeared, incomprehensible at first, but slowly, terrifyingly, piecing together a mosaic of what was truly happening. One night, a sudden, violent shudder ran through the hangar, rattling the corrugated steel walls and sending tools clattering to the concrete floor. A low guttural roar, unlike any engine sound, echoed through the cavernous space, followed by an abrupt, absolute silence. Then, the frantic shouts of the American personnel. Brandt, rigid with fear, clutched Richter's arm, his eyes wide and unseeing in the gloom. The smell of ozone was overwhelming, thick and suffocating. This wasn't about a new weapon to bomb enemy cities. This was about something else entirely, something that twisted the fabric of reality. Colonel Thomas Sterling, in his declassified reflections on ghost channels, admitted that some projects ventured into areas that strained credulity even for wartime exigency. He spoke of a desperate intellectual arms race, where the lines between science fiction and military research blurred, fueled by rumors of similar German and Soviet efforts. The colonel, overseeing Richter and Brandt, became less an officer and more a jailer, his earlier promises of repatriation replaced by thinly veiled threats. His voice, once gruff but measured, now carried an edge of desperation, his eyes constantly scanning the shadows. The journal's final entries detail a conversation Richter overheard between the colonel and one of the lead scientists, late one evening. The scientist, his voice low and strained, spoke of unforeseen side effects and unstable energy signatures. He mentioned localized spatial anomalies and a critical mass. The colonel responded with chilling clarity. Failure is not an option. We have too much invested, and these two, they've seen too much. The words hung in the air, cold and final, like the metallic clang of a closing door. The vast, indifferent Kansas sky outside offered no solace. Richter and Brandt exchanged a look, a silent, profound understanding passing between them. They were no longer valuable assets, they were witnesses. And the price of their knowledge, they now understood, was absolute silence. The promise of freedom had been a cruel deception, a bait to lure them into a project too dangerous, too secret to ever allow them to leave. The humming of the machinery, once an irritating background noise, now felt like a countdown. The dry, red dust that coated everything in the hangar seemed to settle not just on objects, but on their very souls, a fine layer of dread. What choice did they have when faced with such an impossible truth? The unspoken words from the colonel and the scientist, hanging heavy in the ozone-laced air, solidified Richter and Brandt's horrifying realization. The metallic clang of the hangar door, closing each night, now sounded less like a security measure and more like the final, definitive click of a trap. The blue-white light from the conical devices, once merely unsettling, began to feel malevolent, its pulses growing more erratic, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like specters across the grimy concrete floor. Brandt, whose earlier stoicism had slowly eroded, now moved with a palpable tremor, his hands often brushing against the cold, rough steel of the machinery, as if seeking a last anchor in a world unmooring. The experiments intensified, the low hum of the devices often escalated into a piercing whine, vibrating through the very soles of their boots, making their teeth ache. Richter's journal entries from this period became less about technical details and more about raw, sensory overload. He described the air growing thick, heavy, almost viscous, as if resisting their movements. The pervasive smell of ozone was now often punctuated by a sharp, sulfuric tang, like something burned and alien. The American technicians, once merely focused, now moved with a frantic, desperate energy, their faces pale under the harsh work lights, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and obsessive curiosity. Dr. Eleanor Vance, in her analysis of similar clandestine efforts, noted that the push for breakthroughs, especially in uncharted scientific territory, often superseded concerns for safety or ethical boundaries in the final, desperate stages of wartime research. One afternoon, a sudden, violent surge of energy ripped through the hangar. A blinding flash of blue-white light engulfed one of the conical devices, followed by an explosive crackle that momentarily deafened them. The air immediately became supercharged, bristling with static electricity, causing the hair on their arms to stand on end. Tools on a nearby workbench flew outwards, clattering against the walls, and a faint, acrid smoke began to curl from the device. Panic erupted among the American personnel. The colonel, his face a mask of grim determination, bellowed orders, his voice raw, cutting through the chaos. He wasn't just directing, he was containing. This wasn't merely an experiment, it was a tightrope walk over an abyss. Richter and Brandt, huddled together, watched the frantic activity, their own fear mingling with a chilling understanding. This project was unstable, it was dangerous, and they were trapped inside it. The colonel, seeing their wide, terrified eyes, walked directly towards them, his boots echoing loudly on the concrete, the scent of his stale tobacco and desperation preceding him. He stopped inches from Richter, his gaze unwavering, his voice a low, gravelly whisper in German. "You will forget what you have seen here," he commanded, his eyes like chips of ice. "You will complete your tasks, and then you will disappear. For good. The implication was stark, undeniable. Repatriation was no longer an option. Their very existence had become a liability. The vast, indifferent Kansas sky outside, glimpsed through a crack in the hangar doors, seemed to offer no escape, no solace. The sun, usually a symbol of warmth, now felt like a distant, mocking eye. Brant, in a moment of desperate defiance, tried to slip a small, folded piece of paper, a rough sketch of one of the devices, into his boot, hoping to hide it. But the colonel, ever vigilant, caught the subtle movement. With a swift, brutal efficiency, an American guard seized Brant, twisting his arm behind his back. The paper was confiscated, torn to shreds before their eyes. No unauthorized souvenirs, the colonel stated flatly, his voice devoid of emotion. The message was clear. Every action, every thought was under surveillance. The last flicker of hope died in that moment. They were not prisoners of war anymore. They were prisoners of a secret, caught in the undertow of a project that defied conventional understanding. The persistent, high-pitched ringing in Richter's ears grew louder, a constant reminder of the energy pulsing around them, and the profound disorientation he'd noted earlier became a gnawing, ever-present sensation, as if the very air refused to stay still. What was the true nature of this terrifying discovery that demanded not just their silence, but their complete and utter erasure? The journal's final frantic entry, scrawled almost illegibly, described not an escape. Eleanor Vance, recalling her initial review of the journal, noted the chilling consistency with accounts of experimental physics gone awry. It wasn't a conventional disappearance, she concluded, but an absorption, an unintended consequence of pushing beyond known limits. The terrifying discovery Richter and Brant made was not just what the experiment was, but that they were participants in a process that could erase not just a person, but their very presence from time and space. The colonel and his team were not just covering up a secret. They were containing a catastrophic, unintended outcome. This explains why, for 38 years, official records remained silent, a bureaucratic wall of missing in action status. Richter and Brant hadn't simply vanished with fuel. They had been consumed by the same clandestine project the fuel powered, becoming an unfortunate, permanent side effect. The backpack, unearthed decades later, was a relic from the edge of that impossible event, perhaps ejected by the spatial anomaly itself, landing near a forgotten railroad spur, a silent testament to a truth too bizarre for official channels. The discovery didn't just close the loop on vanished fuel supplies. It laid bare how the rigid protocols of wartime could intersect with murky, desperate agendas, creating voids in history. It was a stark reminder that some secrets are so profound, so dangerous, they demand an absolute, terrifying silence. What other untold stories, hidden in plain sight, are still waiting to be unearthed from the shadows of history? If these journeys into the past compel you, consider subscribing to WW2 Stories to continue exploring the forgotten corners of our world.